Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf. Today I'm doing my February reading wrap-up. I read 3 classics and 1 science fiction book. So with that said, let's get into it. So first I read Claudius by Robert Graves. You may have already seen my review on the book. This is the best book I've read this year so far, my first Graves novel, and it follows Claudius, the soon-to-be emperor of ancient Rome, the 4th of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and this is written as a memoir of his life up from the Civil War before he was born between Octavius and Marcus Antonius up until the day he becomes emperor. And it follows 3 distinct rulers of the dynasty up to this point: Octavius, Tiberius, and Caligula, each with their own with their own themes to delve into and their own little quirks, if you will, some more deadly than others. And Claudius captures this brilliantly. Robert Graves is a witty writer. He's an observant writer, and he clearly loves history, and he loves this specific point in history as well. And all that shows in Claudius's narration. As I said with Yevgeny Onegin, half of what makes the book so great is the narrator's humanity. And the same can be said with Claudius here. He will occasionally go on these diatribes about different cultures because that's what he loves, or histories because that's what he loves, because before he became emperor, he was basically disrespected by the Julio-Claudian dynasty and by Rome as a whole due to his birth defects, and which he also hyped up according to this novel. And so a lot of his time was spent writing novels or writing books and histories, and that passion shows here in the narration. But also, it also never downplays the actual danger going on. If you're interested in learning about this period of history, Claudius is a great book to start off that pursuit, because a lot of it is basically taken from Suetonius and Tacitus almost beat for beat. And I do have some issues with the book, but they're not so bad that it stops this book from being a 10 out of 10 read for me. You cannot put this book down once you get into it. It does take about 50 pages or so to get into, but once you're into it, I dare you to stop because it's brilliant. I also read Contact by Carl Sagan. This is recommended to me by Steve Donahue, and this is the first hard science fiction sci-fi book I've read in a very long time. And the novel follows Ellie Arroway, who's a doctor and a scientist who works in trying to contact different alien civilizations through radios, through cosmic radios. I'm not a scientist. I don't really know the exact science behind it, but basically she's running this operation that gets very little government funding and very little attention, and is almost on the verge of being taken down by the U.S. government, until one day they receive a signal from somewhere else, from a planet or a star system called Vega, and it projects to them a video of Hitler's speech at the 1939 Olympics, and that raises a ton of questions because this novel takes place at the turn almost at the turn of 2000, so 1999. Well, I guess the main part takes place in 1999. It sprawls throughout a large period of time. It starts with around when Ellie is a child, and then the book ends when she's around 50. So it does span a decent amount of time, but most of the novel takes place around the 1990s, basically. And her character is very scientifically focused, but also a romantic. She doesn't want to think... This isn't a novel where the aliens are necessarily evil. She wants to think in the best of them and wants to think that they're reaching out to her for a reason, that maybe humanity is at this point where they can now join the intergalactic hub of other civilizations. They've reached this point of evolution where they're now accepted, and that's her running theory. However, this is a global issue, and Carl Sagan handles the many aspects of what could realistically happen if we were reached out to by an alien civilization. And even though it happens to a U.S. radio, other countries want to have a role in it as well. They don't want the U.S. to be the only people to talk to the aliens and that communicate with the aliens. So this operation of trying to build a spaceship to take them to where they think Vega is basically relies upon scientists and governments from all around the world. And so Ellie and her crew are from all different nationalities. She's the American. He's a Russian scientist with her, scientists from Nigeria, India, and China. And each of the scientists that she works with have different interests, different characters, and speaking with them, you find out their backstories, and they're all very interesting. And also, they all have different theories on why the aliens are reaching out to us, humans. And there's a very interesting part where she's talking to the Russian scientist. And as an American, She assumes that, as I just mentioned, she assumes that they've achieved something, and that's why the aliens are reaching out to them, this more advanced species. But the Russian has a different perspective. I'm going to read that part as followed. So this is the Russian scientist Vega speaking. I'm worried this will all end badly, he said. There are so many things that can go wrong. Technological failures, political failures, human failures. And even if we get through all that, if we don't have a war because of the machine, if we build it correctly and without blowing ourselves up, I'm still worried. About what? How do you mean? This is Ellie. And Vega responds, the best that can happen is we will be made fools of. Who will? Ellie asks. Arroway, don't you understand? A vein in Lunacharsky's neck throbbed. I'm amazed you don't see it. The Earth is a ghetto. Yes, a ghetto. All human beings are trapped here. We have heard vaguely that there are big cities out there beyond the ghetto, with broad boulevards filled with drashkis and beautiful perfumed women in furs. But the cities are too far away, and we are too poor ever to go there, even the richest of us. Anyway, we know they don't want us. That's why they've left us in this pathetic little village in this first place. So the novel does a great job of providing stakes to what will happen once they actually reach out to this alien civilization, if they can discover them. And even though Ellie has certain assumptions, Sagan does a great job of introducing other variables of different scientists from different perspectives. Perhaps it is Lunacharsky's perspective growing up and living in the Soviet Union that makes him think that these alien species that are more evolved than they are will treat them poorly. Or I think in this case, like the alien civilization is a metaphor for governments and government officials, whereas Ellie thinks that the government in this case is good and is trying to help them out. So different perspectives from different people is very interesting, and also goes on a lot about religion. So as I said, this is a huge event in human history, and therefore a lot of people from different backgrounds have something to say about it. And so Ellie has to deal with religious officials as well as scientists and government officials, all trying to get into her way for various reasons. And there are two religious officials that she mainly speaks to. One is named Joss. The other one, whose name I can't think of right at this moment, is very hardline Christian. Doesn't really think about what he believes. He just is sort of spreading quotes from the Bible without really much consideration, whereas Joss is a little more considerate about what he believes and why he believes it. And again, very interesting debates. And Carl Sagan himself is agnostic, and was agnostic, he's not alive anymore, but was agnostic, and he said in a quote that, I'll paraphrase, that there's no definitive evidence that God exists, and there's no definitive evidence that God doesn't exist. And that is perfectly captured in the character of Ellie Arroway. She's not trying to disprove, she's not purposefully just neglecting Christianity or any religion. She just doesn't see any evidence to support it right now, so therefore she's not going to completely align herself with Christian ideals or Christian beliefs because there's no real evidence to support it. But on the contrary side, there's no evidence to dispute it either, so therefore she's not going to be completely a complete atheist either. And her curious mind and with the romanticism as well is all handled very well. She feels like a very complicated character and someone who you want to see succeed. Ellie's complex thoughts on faith and religion are very well summarized in this conversation that she has with Joss, and I'll read the section as follows. This wasn't the job description when I accepted the directorship of the Argus Project, he said this lightly. I'm a Christian in the sense that I find Jesus Christ to be an admirable historical figure. I think the Sermon on the Mount is one of the greatest ethical statements and one of the best speeches in history. I think that love your enemy might even be the long-shot solution to the problem of nuclear war. I wish he was alive today. It would benefit everybody on the planet. But I think Jesus was only a man. A great man, a brave man, a man with insight into unpopular truths. But I don't think he was God or the Son of God or the grandnephew of God. You don't want to believe in God, Joss said. It was a simple statement. You figure you can be a Christian and not believe in God? Let me ask you straight out. Do you believe in God? The question has a peculiar structure. If I say no, do I mean I'm convinced God doesn't exist? Or do I mean I'm not convinced he does exist? Those are two very different statements. Let's see if they are so different, Dr. Arroway. May I call you doctor? You believe in Occam's razor. Isn't that right? If you have two equally If you have two different, equally good explanations of the same experience, you pick the simplest. The whole history of science supports it. You say, now, if you have serious doubt about whether there is a God, enough doubt, so you're unwilling to commit yourself to faith, then you must be able to imagine a world without God. A world that comes into being without God. A world that goes about its everyday life without God. A world where people die without God. No punishment, no reward. All the saints and prophets, all the faithful who have ever lived. Why you'd have to believe they were foolish, deceived themselves, you'd probably say. What would a world be? What would be a world in which we weren't here on Earth for any good reason? I mean, for any purpose. It would all be just complicated collisions of atoms. Is that right? Including the atoms that are inside human beings. And then Ellie responds, I thought you were going to argue that God is the simpler hypothesis, Ellie said, but this is a much better point. If it were only a matter of scientific discussion, I'd agree with you, Reverend Joss. Science is essentially concerned with examining, correcting hypotheses. If the laws of nature explain all the available facts without supernatural intervention, or even do only as well as the God hypothesis, then, for the time being, I'd call myself an atheist. So Allie is essentially just a curious person. She isn't going to believe anything without any proper evidence, and that's a consistent character trait for her character throughout the novel. And if I had just one small gripe about the book, it would be that the actual contact with the alien species or her space travel is kind of briefer than I want it to be. I wish there was more, but I don't really want to go into spoilers, so I'll just leave it as vague as possible with that regard. I also read Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is my second Dostoyevsky novel, the first being Crime and Punishment, which I read in 2021, and I didn't particularly enjoy. I enjoyed the first act and the last act, but everything in the middle, or most things in the middle, didn't particularly do it for me. That's okay, but I wanted to give him a second try, and I really liked Notes from Underground. It is a shorter novel, which I think is to the book's benefit, and to my benefit, I guess, as someone who is sort of agnostic towards the full unbridled love that Dostoyevsky gets. I think this is a very concise novel, and it follows the underground man as he recounts his philosophy in his life, as he's completely secluded himself from the rest of the world, from public life. He's a man of many contradictions, and it's funny when you look at people critiquing books and movies and television shows when they're talking about characters, oh, this doesn't make sense, this isn't true to his character, this is a contradiction, makes him seem hypocritical, this is a mistake in the writing. Fyodor Dostoyevsky's psychological work in Notes from Underground is some of the best psychological work I've ever read. This man is filled with contradictions. He is both the vainest man in the world, and yet he also clearly is the most self-loathing as well. He is an agent of chaos. Whenever he tries and nearly makes friends or a relationship in general, things seem to start out well, and then he completely, by his own will, destroys whatever potential love or connection he can have in his life. And then he blames on everyone else, and then he blames on himself, and then he blames on everyone else again. And it captures the irrationality of people, I think. We're all capable of thinking irrationally. We might have one thought, and then the next thought we have completely contradicts the first thought. And that is captured in the stream of consciousness-esque story of a man who's thinks one thing, you're oh, that's completely way off kilter, why would you think that, you're insane. And the next is a little bit of self-reflection, you're oh, is it coming around to actually acknowledging his own flaws? And then he goes back to being completely vain and egotistical and delusional. And it's infuriating in one regard because there are glimpses of this man being able to reflect and improve, and then he descends back into the safety that is vanity, that is egotism. And that's kind of what the underground is to a certain extent, until it ends and he decides in that moment, that in this final moment of self-reflection, that he cannot participate in society, that he's not psychologically able to. He's ultimately a man who wants a lot from life but cannot get it. And this is Dostoyevsky, I'm assuming, commenting on Russian society at the time, where he lives in this, like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, he lives in a really bad area. He has a really bad apartment that he's extremely self-conscious about, and he doesn't have a lot of opportunities, a lot of prospects, and a lot of that is enforced on him by outside issues, but at the same time, he still wants those opportunities in higher prospects, but he cannot get them. And whenever a potential relationship or good thing in his life comes along, he has to knock it down. And then you have to blame him for these issues as well, because at the same time, he welcomes the pain and the suffering. Again, Dostoyevsky isn't one of his philosophies like love is suffering, but whereas Raskolnikov gains something from suffering, this character does not gain anything. He just becomes further reclusive from society. And I think a lot of it has to do with the power dynamic. He acknowledges at one point that he's a tyrant. He wants in his relationships to be the powerful figure. And whenever someone is potentially better at him than anything, and when someone comes along that's potentially better than him in any aspect of life, he freaks out and then has to verbally berate them in order to feel powerful again. He needs that feeling of power. He's a tyrant in one regard. He's a coyote who wants to be a lion, basically. And just going through that was such a pleasant experience. I was actually sad when the novel was done, because being inside this character's head, even though it's completely deranged, it's also very compelling as well, because you get those glimpses of self-reflection that never completely fulfill themselves. And finally, I read Heart of the Dog by Mikhail Bulgakov, Master Margarita, which I read at the end of 2021. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I found this at a bookstore, and I wanted to read it. And it's a short story about, I'll actually read the plot synopsis of the back of the book, because it's pretty unique. This hilarious, brilliantly inventive novel by the author of The Master Margarita tells the story of a scroungy Moscow mongrel named Sharik. Thanks to the skills of a renowned Soviet scientist and the transplanted pituitary gland and testes of a petty criminal, Sharik transformed into a lecherous, vulgar man who spouts angles and inevitably finds his niche in the bureaucracy as the government official in charge of purging the city of cats. Great plot synopsis. Too bad I was very disappointed by the short story. Master Margarita is so nuanced, so insane, but also so heartfelt at the same time. And I just didn't really get that from this book. The one highlight, I would say, of Heart of the Dog is when Sharik goes under the knife. He's forced into surgery by a professor who welcomes into his home with food. And it feels so inappropriate, like the way Bulgakov describes the surgery, how it goes. Like he's being cut around the torso, and he's being cut on the skull, and it's so invasive, and it's just disgusting, but it's the most impactful part of the book. And it never really, I feel like I thought there's gonna be scenes of him going to he'd be on the rise as a bureaucrat, like this part dog, part human, and his animal instincts help him thrive in the government world. Like his selfish animalistic instinct helps him thrive in it. But it never really happens. It just kind of focuses on the scientists are on the lab, and they just go whoa, Sharik is crazy, right? And then Sharik does something, he breaks a pipe, and then they talk about it. And then there's no inventiveness really that I found in Master Margarita to be so compelling. It's completely, I felt like it was just lacking here. And I don't know, it was decent. Again, I said there was a couple really interesting scenes, but it just never really takes the concept to any meaningful way or any meaningful point that I wanted to see it taken to. So ultimately I was disappointed by it, especially because I just love Master Margarita so much. And yeah, I always end these videos on a down note for some reason. I don't really mean to, but I just don't have much to say about The Heart of the Dog because it didn't do anything for me really. But yeah, what book did you read in February? Or have you read any books that I read? What do you think about them? But I'd be more interested in hearing what books you read about in the month of February. So yeah, thank you for watching this video. If you made it this far, check out my other books. Check out my other videos. Check out my book as well. Check out my other videos, especially the Claudius review, if you want more of my in-depth thoughts on Claudius. And yeah, so hopefully see you in the next video. Thank you and goodbye.